Beneath an endless dome of sky, where the heavens stretch unbroken from horizon to horizon, the Mongolian steppes roll like a vast emerald ocean frozen in time. The wind moves across this immensity with a voice older than memory, carrying the scent of wild grasses and distant rain, whispering secrets that only the earth itself remembers. Here, in the 12th century, the land breathes with a rhythm unchanged since the world was young, each season painting the grasslands in different hues, while the eternal dance between sky and earth continues its ancient choreography. The steppes possess a quality of light found nowhere else on earth, a clarity that seems to magnify every detail while simultaneously revealing the profound emptiness that defines this landscape. Morning brings a silver radiance that transforms dewdrops into countless diamonds scattered across the grass, while evening wraps the land in amber and gold, the sun setting not behind mountains or trees, but simply dissolving into the endless plain as if the earth itself was swallowing fire. In this vastness, the horizon becomes less a boundary than a promise, always retreating as one approaches, always offering the possibility of something beyond. The grasses themselves tell the story of this land, their countless varieties, creating a tapestry of survival perfectly adapted to the harsh rhythms of continental weather. Feather grasses bend and sway in graceful arcs, their silvery plumes catching light like captured moonbeams, while the hardier bunch grasses cluster close to the earth, forming dense cushions that can withstand the crushing cold of winter and the searing heat of summer. Between them grow the smaller treasures of the steppe, wild onions and garlic that perfume the air when crushed underfoot, medicinal herbs whose properties have been known to the nomads for countless generations, and the tiny, brilliant flowers that appear briefly each spring like scattered jewels across the green expanse. Water defines life on these plains, and its presence shapes everything from the movement of herds to the location of camps. Rivers wind across the landscape like silver serpents, their banks lined with the taller grasses and occasional stands of willow and birch trees that seem almost miraculous in this largely treeless world. These waterways create oases of different vegetation, their courses marked from great distances by the darker green of their riparian forests, calling to both animals and humans with the promise of life itself. Springs bubble up from underground rivers, creating marshy areas where different plants flourish and migrating birds pause in their journeys across continents. The animals of the steppe have evolved alongside this landscape for millennia, their lives intimately connected to the seasonal rhythms of grass growth, weather patterns, and the eternal search for water. Wild horses, the ancestors of the mounts that would one day carry Mongol warriors across continents, move in herds across the plains, their movements creating distant dust clouds that shimmer in the heat like earthbound mirages. These horses possess a hardiness born of surviving brutal winters and scorching summers, their compact bodies and thick manes testaments to the selective pressure of this unforgiving environment. Alongside them graze the wild asses, smaller and more delicate, but equally adapted to life on these endless grasslands. The great herds of antelope that sweep across the steppes represent one of nature's most spectacular displays, their seasonal migrations involving hundreds of thousands of animals moving in synchronized waves across hundreds of miles. These creatures embody the essence of the steppe itself. Swift, graceful, and utterly dependent on the freedom to move across vast distances in search of fresh grass and water. Their presence enriches the soil with their droppings, creates paths that channel water flow, and supports the complex web of predators and scavengers that depend on their abundance. Wolves shadow these herds, their grey forms nearly invisible against the dried grasses of autumn and winter, their howls carrying for miles across the empty landscape in the crystalline air of cold nights. These apex predators have shaped the behavior of prey animals for countless generations, their presence maintaining the delicate balance that allows the grasslands to flourish without being overgrazed. The relationship between predator and prey here reflects the broader rhythm of life on the steppes, where survival depends not on hiding from the challenges of existence, but on developing the strength and cunning to face them directly. Into this landscape, sometime in the mists of prehistory, came the first nomadic peoples. drawn perhaps by the abundance of game, the vastness that promised freedom from enemies, or simply by the irresistible call of the horizon itself. These early inhabitants learned to read the subtle signs that the steppe offered, the quality of grass that indicated good pasture, the flight patterns of birds that revealed water sources, the behavior of wild animals that warned of approaching storms. They developed a way of life that flowed with the natural rhythms of this land, moving their camps and herds in harmony with the seasons and the availability of resources. The dwellings of these nomadic peoples reflected their deep understanding of steppe conditions, designed for mobility while providing protection from the fierce winds and extreme temperatures that characterize the continental climate. The ger, or yurt, represents one of humanity's most elegant solutions to the challenge of creating portable shelter. Its circular design and flexible construction, allowing it to withstand the powerful storms that sweep across the plains, while being light enough to be quickly assembled or dismantled as the tribe moved to new pastures. The white felt walls of these dwellings create spots of brightness across the landscape, visible for miles in the clear air, marking the temporary presence of human communities in the vastness. The social structure of these nomadic tribes evolved to match the demands of their environment, creating flexible hierarchies that could respond quickly to changing conditions, while maintaining the cooperation necessary for survival in such a challenging landscape. Leadership emerged naturally from demonstrated skill in reading weather patterns, finding good pasture, and protecting the community from both natural dangers and human enemies. These leaders possessed an intimate knowledge of the land that extended far beyond their immediate territory, understanding the connections between distant mountain watersheds and steppe rivers, between the flowering of certain plants and the movements of game animals, between the behavior of their livestock and the approach of severe weather. The rhythm of nomadic life followed patterns as ancient and reliable as the turning of seasons themselves, each phase of the year bringing its own challenges, opportunities, and rituals. Spring brought the exhausting but joyful work of helping animals give birth to their young, the careful movement to fresh pastures as the grass began to grow, and the gradual emergence from the hardships of winter survival. Summer meant long days of herding animals across the richest pastures, the gathering of wild foods to supplement the diet of meat and dairy products, and the social season, when scattered tribes might come together for trade, marriages, and the sharing of news from distant regions. The wealth of these nomadic communities lay not in accumulated possessions, which would only burden their movements, but in their herds of animals, their knowledge of the land, and their skill in the complex arts of survival on the steppes. Horses represented the ultimate measure of wealth and status, not merely as transportation, but as partners in the demanding work of herding other animals across vast distances. The finest horses were prized not only for their speed and endurance, but for their intelligence and the subtle communication that developed between horse and rider during long days and months of working together across the endless grasslands. Into this world of endless grass and shifting alliances, a child was born who would reshape the very foundations of human civilization. The year was around 1162, though the exact date remains lost to the winds that sweep across the steppes, and the child's first cries mingled with the sounds of a Mongol encampment settling into the rhythm of another day. His father, Yesugei, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man whose reputation extended far beyond his own tribe's grazing grounds. When the infant emerged into the flickering light of the felt-covered ger, the midwives noticed something remarkable clutched in his tiny fist, a clot of blood, dark and substantial, as if he had seized a piece of his destiny before even drawing breath. This omen, according to Mongol tradition, marked the child as one destined for greatness, someone who would spill much blood in his lifetime. They named him Temüjin, after a Tatar warrior whom Yesugei had recently defeated in battle, following the custom of bestowing upon newborns the names of conquered enemies as a form of spiritual dominance. The name itself carried the weight of iron and conflict, derived from the Mongol word for iron, that most precious of metals on the steppes. From his earliest moments, Temüjin was thus bound to the cycles of war and conquest that defined Mongol existence, his very identity forged in the crucible of tribal rivalry. The encampment where Temüjin spent his early years moved with the ancient rhythms of pastoral life, following the herds across vast expanses of grassland that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. The felt walls of the family jur filtered the harsh steppes light into a warm, golden glow, creating a world of intimate shadows where the young boy learned the fundamental lessons of Mongol culture. His mother, Hoylan, had been captured in a raid, taken from her first husband in the violent courtship rituals common among the tribes. Yet she had adapted to her new life with the resilience that characterized the women of the steppes. Her voice filled the jair with stories of heroes and spirits, of the eternal blue sky that watched over all Mongols, and of the sacred mountains where the ancestors dwelt. Yesugei ruled his followers with the careful balance of strength and wisdom required to maintain unity among the fractious Mongol clans. His reputation as a warrior was matched by his skill as a diplomat, able to navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that shifted like the patterns of wind across the grassland. The chieftain understood that power on the steppes was never permanent, that today's ally could become tomorrow's mortal enemy, and that survival depended on constant vigilance and the ability to read the subtle signs that preceded betrayal. Under his guidance, the Borjigin clan had prospered, their herds growing fat on the rich pastures, their warriors earning respect through successful raids against neighboring tribes. The young Temüjin absorbed these lessons through observation and experience, learning to read the moods of horses and men with equal facility. He discovered early that leadership among the Mongols was not simply inherited, but earned through demonstration of courage, cunning, and the indefinable quality the tribes called silda, the spiritual power that marked a true leader. His father's warriors watched the boy with interest, noting his quick intelligence and the fierce pride that flashed in his dark eyes when challenged. Even as a child, Temüjin displayed an intensity that set him apart, a burning focus that seemed to consume everything in its path. The steppes themselves served as Temüjin's first classroom, teaching lessons that no sedentary civilization could provide. He learned to read weather patterns in the behavior of birds, to find water by observing the flight paths of insects, and to judge the health of grassland by the subtle variations in color and texture that escaped untrained eyes. The vast spaces developed in him a keen spatial awareness and an understanding of distance and movement that would later prove invaluable in military campaigns. Most importantly, the steppes taught him patience, the ability to wait for the right moment to act, whether stalking prey or planning an attack on enemies. When Temüjin reached the age of 9, his father decided it was time to arrange the boy's betrothal, following the Mongol custom of securing alliances through marriage agreements made while the intended spouses were still children. The match had been carefully chosen, a girl named Borte from the Ongirat tribe, a clan known for the beauty and intelligence of their women. The journey to the Ongirat lands took several days, crossing rolling hills where wildflowers created vast carpets of color that shifted and changed with each passing breeze. Father and son rode together across this landscape, Yesugei sharing the accumulated wisdom of his years, while Temüjin listened with the intense concentration that would characterize all his learning. The negotiations with Berte's father proceeded smoothly, both men recognizing the mutual benefits of linking their clans through marriage. Berte herself was a remarkable child, possessed of a quiet strength and keen intelligence that impressed even the young Temüjin. The betrothal ceremony was conducted with all the proper rituals, invoking the blessings of the eternal blue sky and the spirits of the ancestors. As was customary, Temüjin would remain with his future bride's family for a time, learning their ways and cementing the bonds between the clans. The arrangement pleased all parties, creating hope for a future marked by cooperation rather than conflict. The return journey began under favorable omens, the weather clear and the grasslands verdant with spring growth. Yesugei traveled with a lightened heart, satisfied that he had secured his son's future and strengthened his clan's position through this strategic alliance. The chieftain could not have known that he was riding toward his doom, that enemies had been watching and waiting for just such an opportunity. The Mongol world was one of constant peril, where death could strike without warning, and where even the most careful preparations might prove insufficient against the malice of rivals. The Tatars, ancient enemies of the Mongols, had not forgotten their defeats at Yesugei's hands. These nomadic warriors, themselves skilled in the arts of war and deception, had been tracking the chieftain's movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They understood that killing Yesugei in open battle would be difficult and costly, but they also knew that the steppes offered subtler methods of eliminating enemies. When they learned of his journey to arrange his son's betrothal, they saw their chance and began to plan their revenge with the patience and cunning that characterized the most successful predators of the grasslands. The encounter occurred at what appeared to be a chance meeting, the kind of casual interaction between travelers that was common on the vast steppes. A group of Tatars, disguising their true intentions behind masks of hospitality, invited Yesugei to share food and drink with them, following the ancient customs of the steppes that made such invitations sacred obligations. The chieftain, though wary by nature, could not refuse without giving grave offense, and the situation seemed innocent enough, fellow nomads sharing the basic courtesies that made life on the steppes possible. The Tatar poison worked slowly, designed to mimic the symptoms of a wasting disease rather than causing immediate and obvious death. Yesugei began to feel unwell during the journey home, but initially attributed his discomfort to something he had eaten, or perhaps the onset of a seasonal illness. As the symptoms worsened, however, a terrible understanding began to dawn. The poison coursed through his system with relentless efficiency, sapping his strength and clouding his thoughts, while leaving his mind clear enough to comprehend what was happening. By the time he reached his own lands, the great chieftain was dying, his body betraying him even as his spirit remained unbroken. The knowledge that he had been outmaneuvered by his enemies filled him with a rage that burned even hotter than the poison consuming his flesh. In his final moments, Yesugei summoned what remained of his strength to ensure his clan's survival and his son's future. He called for his most trusted followers, men who had shared countless battles and whose loyalty had been tested in the crucible of war. To these warriors, he entrusted the protection of his family and the continuation of his bloodline. His dying words carried the weight of prophecy, speaking of a son who would surpass even his father's achievements and reshape the world according to his will. The great chieftain's death marked the end of an era for the Borjigin clan, leaving behind a power vacuum that would test every bond of loyalty and kinship that held the tribe together. The death of Yesugei cast a shadow across the Mongolian steppes that would stretch through seasons of unrelenting hardship. Young Temüjin, barely 9 years old, found himself thrust into a world where survival meant learning the harsh mathematics of the wilderness, where each decision carried the weight of life or death, and where the slightest miscalculation could mean the difference between another sunrise and eternal darkness beneath the endless sky. The boy who would one day command armies stretching from horizon to horizon now faced his first and perhaps most brutal campaign, the simple act of staying alive. The Taishiud tribe, those who had once served under his father's banner, turned their backs on the grieving family with the cold efficiency of wolves abandoning the wounded. Their rejection carried the cruel logic of steppe politics. Supporting a weakened clan offered no advantage, only the burden of additional mouths to feed during the lean months when winter winds stripped the grasslands bare and game grew scarce. Holun, Temujin's mother, watched helplessly as the gurs of their former allies disappeared over distant ridges, their departure marked only by the fading sound of hoofbeats and the bitter taste of betrayal that would linger on her tongue for years to come. Left with her children and a handful of loyal retainers, Holun faced the impossible task of keeping her family alive in a landscape that showed mercy to no one. The family's herds, once symbols of prosperity and status, had been systematically stolen or claimed by rival clans who sensed weakness like carrion birds circling above a dying animal. The great felt tent, that had sheltered them through countless seasons was abandoned for smaller, more portable shelters that could be quickly dismantled and moved when danger approached, a necessity that would define their existence for years to come. The steppes that had once seemed like an endless paradise of rolling grass and boundless sky transformed into an arena of constant vigilance and desperate resourcefulness. Hoyland taught her children to read the subtle signs that meant survival, the way morning frost gathered differently around hidden springs, the particular angle of grass that revealed the presence of underground water, the distant movements of wildlife that might signal approaching strangers or the promise of a successful hunt. Every piece of knowledge became precious currency in their daily battle against starvation and exposure. Temüjin learned to move through the landscape like a ghost, his footsteps silent on ground that might betray his presence to enemies or prey. The boy developed an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings, able to sense the approach of riders long before they appeared on the horizon, to distinguish between the calls of different birds and what their behaviors revealed about the hidden activities of the steppe. His eyes grew sharp from scanning vast distances for signs of danger or opportunity, while his hands learned the delicate art of setting snares for small game and the patient skill required to coax fire from damp tinder during the endless rains of autumn. The family survived on a diet that would have seemed impossible to their former lives of relative comfort. Wild onions and roots supplemented the occasional rabbit or marmot that Temüjin managed to trap, while fish caught from the clear streams that wound through the grasslands provided protein during the times when larger game proved elusive. Hoyland showed remarkable ingenuity in preparing these meager resources, creating nourishing broths from bones that had been boiled multiple times, and finding ways to preserve meat during the brief periods when fortune smiled upon their hunting efforts. Winter brought challenges that tested every lesson learned during the warmer months. The family constructed crude shelters from whatever materials the landscape provided, stones piled carefully to break the wind, hides stretched over frameworks of branches, deep pits lined with grass and covered with whatever could keep out the snow and bitter cold. During the worst storms, they huddled together for warmth, while the wind howled across the steppes, with a voice that seemed to carry the accumulated sorrows of all who had perished in this unforgiving wilderness. Temüjin's body hardened during these years of deprivation, his muscles becoming lean and efficient from the constant demands of survival. His skin grew tough from exposure to sun and wind, while his reflexes sharpened from the need to react instantly to threats both human and natural. The boy learned to sleep lightly, always ready to wake at the slightest unusual sound. A skill that would serve him well in future campaigns, where the difference between alertness and death might be measured in heartbeats. The psychological toll of this existence carved itself deep into Temüjin's developing character. Trust became a luxury that could prove fatal, while loyalty revealed itself as the rarest and most precious of human qualities. The boy watched as desperation drove some to betray former friends for handfuls of grain or the promise of shelter, while others demonstrated unexpected nobility by sharing their meager resources with those even less fortunate. These observations formed the foundation of his understanding of human nature, lessons that would later inform his decisions as a leader of vast armies and conquered territories. During particularly harsh periods, the family was forced to separate temporarily, each member pursuing different survival strategies to maximize their collective chances of making it through another season. Temüjin often found himself alone for days or weeks at a time, learning to rely entirely on his own resources and judgment. These solitary journeys across the steppes became a form of advanced education in leadership, teaching him to make difficult decisions without the comfort of consultation or shared responsibility. The landscape itself became his teacher during these wandering years. Every ridge and valley held lessons about strategy and timing, while the behavior of wild animals provided insights into the arts of hunting, evasion, and territorial control. Temüjin learned to think like prey when enemies searched for him, and like a predator when opportunity presented itself. The skills developed during these formative years reading terrain, understanding weather patterns, moving silently through hostile territory would later prove invaluable when he commanded military operations across continents. As seasons turned into years, the boy's reputation began to spread quietly through the scattered communities of the steppes. Stories circulated of Hoyland's remarkable son, the child who could disappear into the landscape like morning mist and reappear where least expected, who could track game across ground that seemed to hold no traces, who displayed a wisdom beyond his years in matters of survival and strategy. These tales, carried by traders and wandering herders, began to attract the attention of others who lived on the margins of steppe society. Outcasts and exiles who recognized in Temüjin a potential leader capable of understanding their struggles and perhaps offering them hope for a different future. The crucible of exile was forging something unprecedented on the Mongolian steppes. A young man whose understanding of hardship and survival ran deeper than that of any traditional clan leader, whose loyalty had been earned rather than inherited, and whose vision extended beyond the conventional boundaries of tribal politics. Each challenge overcome, each winter survived, each enemy evaded, added another layer to the complex foundation of character that would eventually support an empire spanning continents and reshaping the course of human history. The bitter winds that had carved lines into Temujin's weathered face during those years of exile began to carry something new across the endless steppes. Whispers of a young man who survived where others perished, who endured what would have broken lesser spirits. In the scattered camps of the displaced, among the forgotten sons of murdered Khans and the broken remnants of defeated tribes, stories began to circulate like smoke from dying fires. Tales of one who had learned to find water where none seemed to exist, who could track prey across frozen ground that left no trace, who possessed the rare gift of seeing opportunity in the darkest moments of despair. The first to seek him out was Jelmer, a blacksmith's son whose calloused hands bore the permanent stains of iron and fire. A young man whose family had served Yasuge faithfully before the great Khan's poisoning scattered their world like leaves before an autumn gale. Jelmer had watched from the shadows as rival clans divided the spoils of Yasuge's death, had seen his own father reduced from honoured craftsman to wandering beggar, forced to trade his skills for scraps of food and temporary shelter beneath foreign yurts. The humiliation burned in Jelmer's chest like molten metal. And when he heard tales of Yasuge's son still alive, still fighting against the impossible odds that had claimed so many others, something ancient stirred within him. Not just loyalty to a bloodline, but recognition of a kindred spirit who understood the weight of loss and the hunger for restoration. Their first meeting occurred not in ceremony or formal declaration, but in the practical necessity of survival that governed all life on the steppes. Temujin's small band had been tracking a herd of wild horses across the winter landscape, their own mounts growing thin and weak from the relentless cold and sparse grazing, when they discovered fresh tracks leading away from their quarry, the unmistakable marks of skilled riders who had claimed the prize they so desperately needed. Rather than retreat in defeat, Temüjin followed the trail for 3 days through terrain that would have challenged even experienced hunters, his keen eyes reading the story written in hoofprints and disturbed grass, until they came upon a small camp where Jelmer sat alone beside a fire, tending to the very horses they had been pursuing. The confrontation that followed revealed much about both men, though no harsh words were exchanged, no weapons drawn in anger. Jelmer looked up from his work with the steady gaze of one who had expected this moment, who had perhaps even orchestrated it. And in his eyes, Temüjin recognized something beyond mere defiance, a careful evaluation, a testing of character that went both ways. They spoke quietly through the long night, sharing the warmth of the fire and the sparse provisions that constituted wealth in their reduced circumstances, while around them the captured horses moved restlessly in their temporary enclosure, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. By dawn, when the eastern sky began to blush with the promise of another day's survival, an understanding had been reached that required no formal words, no binding oaths, simply the recognition that their separate struggles had become part of a larger pattern, threads in a tapestry that neither could weave alone. More followed in the months that stretched ahead, drawn by the same invisible currents that had brought Jelma into Temüjin's orbit. Borchu arrived next, a young warrior whose noble birth had become meaningless when his father chose the wrong side in a succession dispute, leaving his son to face exile with nothing but his weapons, his horse, and an unshakable belief that true leadership was revealed not in times of plenty, but in moments of absolute desolation. Borchu had tracked Temüjin's band for weeks, observing from a distance, studying the way this unlikely leader moved through the landscape, noting how he shared scarce resources equally among his followers, how he listened to counsel from men who had no titles or formal rank, but whose survival skills had been tested in the crucible of genuine hardship. The addition of each new follower created subtle shifts in the dynamics of the growing group, like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that changed the shape of everything they touched. Subutai came to them after his own clan had been destroyed in a raid, bringing with him not just fierce loyalty, but an intuitive understanding of mounted warfare that would prove invaluable in battles yet to come. His youthful face bore scars that spoke of early encounters with violence, but his eyes held the calculating intelligence of one who had learned to think several moves ahead of his enemies, who understood that victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. Jebe joined them after a chance encounter that began with him as their prisoner, taken during a skirmish with raiders who had been plaguing trade routes. But his obvious skills and frank assessment of his own situation impressed Temüjin enough to offer him a choice between execution and service. A gamble that revealed as much about the leader's growing confidence as it did about his ability to judge character. These men, scattered and broken by circumstances beyond their control, began to coalesce around Temüjin, not through the traditional bonds of kinship or tribal obligation, but through something more fundamental. Shared adversity that had stripped away pretense and revealed essential character. They learned to move together across the vast expanses of grassland like a hunting pack, each member understanding his role without need for constant direction, developing the kind of intuitive coordination that could only emerge from facing genuine danger together. Their camps were sparse affairs, unmarked by the elaborate decorations and rigid hierarchies that characterized established tribal settlements. But within their simple circles of felt and fire, a new kind of brotherhood was taking shape, forged not in comfort, but in the daily necessity of mutual dependence. The leadership that Temüjin exercised over these early followers bore little resemblance to the autocratic rule of traditional khans, emerging instead from practical effectiveness and personal example that inspired confidence rather than demanding submission. When food was scarce, he ate last and least, ensuring that even the newest member of their band received his share before their leader satisfied his own hunger. When dangerous scouting missions required volunteers, he led from the front, exposing himself to risks that lesser commanders would delegate to expendable subordinates. His decisions were made after consultation with men who had proven their worth through action rather than birth, creating an atmosphere where merit mattered more than pedigree, where good ideas could emerge from unexpected sources and receive serious consideration regardless of their origin. The bonds that formed among these outcasts and dispossessed warriors grew stronger with each shared hardship, each successful raid on better-equipped enemies, each narrow escape from superior forces that should have destroyed them, but instead seemed only to strengthen their resolve and refine their tactics. They learned to communicate through subtle gestures and shared glances across smoky, fire-lit spaces, developing the kind of wordless understanding that would later enable them to coordinate complex maneuvers in the heat of battle. Their horses, hardy ponies that reflected their owners' circumstances, grew lean and quick under constant use, becoming extensions of their riders' will in ways that the pampered mounts of wealthy khans could never match. As seasons turned and their reputation spread across the steppes like wildfire carried on restless winds, the small band that had begun with desperate necessity gradually transformed into something that resembled the nucleus of a genuine military force. The men who had once been refugees and exiles began to carry themselves differently, their movements acquiring the confident economy of tested warriors, their eyes holding the steady alertness of those who had learned to survive by their wits and their weapons in a world that offered no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Through it all, Temüjin remained the still center around which this growing constellation of loyalty revolved, his presence providing the stability and direction that transformed individual survival into collective purpose. The boy who had once fled into exile, with nothing but the clothes on his back, had become the focal point for dreams of restoration and revenge that burned quietly in the hearts of men who had lost everything but their determination to reclaim what had been taken from them through treachery and violence. These first followers, drawn from the margins of Mongol society, became the foundation upon which Temüjin would build something far grander than a simple band of outcasts. As word of his growing influence spread across the steppes like smoke from a distant fire, the young leader recognized that survival and expansion would require more than the fierce loyalty of dispossessed warriors. The vast grasslands demanded a different kind of strategy, one woven from the ancient threads of steppe diplomacy. Marriage alliances that bound clans together like sinew wrapping a bow, blood brotherhoods that created unbreakable bonds between warriors, and the delicate art of political maneuvering that could turn enemies into allies with a single well-chosen gesture. The marriage tent, with its felt walls decorated in intricate patterns passed down through generations, became as important a battlefield as any contested pasture. Temüjin understood that each union represented not merely the joining of two people, but the braiding together of entire lineages, their herds, their warrior traditions, and their ancestral grazing rights. His own marriage to Berthe, arranged in his youth, had already demonstrated the power of such alliances, binding her Olkunut tribe to his fortunes, even when those fortunes seemed bleakest. Now, as his influence grew, he began to orchestrate a complex web of matrimonial politics that would stretch across the steppe like an invisible net. The practice of marriage alliance among the Mongol tribes followed patterns as old as the wind itself. Yet Temüjin brought to it a strategic vision that transformed custom into conquest. When promising young warriors joined his growing band, he often sealed their loyalty not just with gifts of horses or shares of plunder, but by arranging marriages between their sisters or daughters and his most trusted lieutenants. These unions created interlocking webs of obligation and mutual interest that ran deeper than mere military command. A warrior might follow a leader for spoils or glory, but he would die for the father of his grandchildren. The felt-walled gurs where these negotiations took place echoed with the soft murmur of careful diplomacy, as clan elders weighed bloodlines against grazing rights, warrior prowess against the size of herds. Temüjin moved through these discussions like a master archer selecting arrows, each choice calculated not for immediate effect, but for how it might serve his greater purpose. He gave his own daughters and adopted daughters in marriage to cement crucial alliances, understanding that each bride who rode away from his camp carried with her not just his bloodline, but his influence into distant tribes. Beyond the formal bonds of marriage lay the even more profound institution of Anda, the sworn brotherhood that bound men together more tightly than blood itself. These relationships, forged in the flickering light of campfires under stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, created loyalties that would endure through decades of warfare and conquest. When two warriors became Anda, they pledged to share everything, herds, wives, even their lives, and to support each other's children as their own. For Temüjin, these brotherhood bonds became instruments of both personal loyalty and strategic expansion. His most famous Anda relationship with Jamukha of the Jadaran tribe illustrated both the power and the peril of such bonds. The two young warriors had sworn their brotherhood beside a stream that ran clear and cold from the mountain snows, drinking fermented mare's milk from the same cup, and promising eternal loyalty beneath the eternal blue sky that the Mongols held sacred. For a time, their combined forces moved across the steppes like a single organism, sharing pastures and victories, their warriors intermingling as freely as their herds. Jamaica's charisma and noble birth complemented Temüjin's growing reputation for strategic brilliance and unwavering loyalty to his followers. Yet, even as this brotherhood flourished, Temüjin was weaving other relationships, creating a network of sworn brothers that extended his influence far beyond his immediate followers. Each new Anda brought with him not just personal loyalty, but connections to other clans, knowledge of distant pastures and potential enemies, and most importantly, legitimacy in the complex social hierarchy of the steppes. A man with many sworn brothers was a man who commanded respect, and respect on the steppes translated directly into the ability to gather followers and influence tribal decisions. The political landscape of the Mongol steppes resembled a vast game played with living pieces, where alliances shifted like shadows as the sun moved across the sky. Temüjin demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to read these shifting currents, to sense when a powerful Khan was growing weak, when a subordinate tribe was ready to break away from its overlords, when drought or defeat had made proud warriors ready to consider new allegiances. His messengers, often women who could travel between camps without arousing suspicion, carried more than simple communications. They carried carefully crafted proposals, subtle threats, and nuanced promises that played upon each tribe's specific needs and fears. The art of gift-giving became another weapon in his arsenal of persuasion. A magnificent horse presented at precisely the right moment could win over a wavering ally more effectively than a dozen victories in battle. Golden ornaments taken from defeated enemies and redistributed to potential friends demonstrated both his success and his generosity. Captured weapons, their steel gleaming with the promise of future victories, spoke to warriors' hearts in ways that words never could. These gifts flowed from Temüjin's growing treasure hoard, like water from a spring, each one calculated to create or strengthen bonds that would serve his expanding ambitions. The seasonal gatherings where tribes came together to trade, arrange marriages, and settle disputes became theatres where Temüjin's political acumen shone brightest. While other leaders might rely on displays of martial prowess or ancestral prestige, he worked the crowds like a master craftsman, speaking privately with influential elders, sharing fermented mare's milk with promising young warriors, and always listening, gathering intelligence about tribal grievances, leadership struggles, and shifting loyalties that might be turned to his advantage. His treatment of defeated enemies revealed perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his political strategy. Rather than following the traditional pattern of slaughter or enslavement, Temüjin often offered former adversaries places of honor within his growing confederation. Warriors who had fought bravely against him found themselves welcomed into his ranks with respect and opportunity for advancement. This unprecedented approach not only swelled his numbers, but sent a powerful message across the steppes. Submission to Temüjin meant opportunity rather than humiliation. The integration of conquered tribes required delicate handling of their existing power structures. Temüjin rarely swept away tribal hierarchies entirely, instead co-opting existing leaders and weaving them into his expanding network of obligation and reward. A defeated Khan might find his daughter married to one of Temüjin's sons, his best warriors incorporated into elite units, and his own status elevated within the new order. These careful accommodations prevented the rebellions that might otherwise have followed conquest, turning potential enemies into stakeholders in his success. As winter winds howled across the steppes and families gathered close around fires that flickered against the darkness, stories began to spread of this remarkable leader who bound men to him not through fear alone, but through the ancient ties that held Mongol society together. The names of his sworn brothers, his marriage allies, and his adopted sons became as well known as those of his victories. Each story reinforced the growing perception that Temüjin was not merely another ambitious warrior, but something new. A leader who understood that true power came not from the sharpness of swords, but from the strength of the bonds that connected one human heart to another across the vast expanse of the endless grasslands. The political marriages and sworn brotherhoods that had elevated Temüjin from exile to prominence now served as the foundation for something far grander than mere tribal dominance. Across the windswept steppes of Mongolia, whispers carried on the autumn winds of 1205, spoke of a gathering unlike any the scattered clans had witnessed in generations. The time had come for the fractured Mongol peoples to consider their destiny beneath a single banner, and the man who had orchestrated alliances through blood, friendship, and calculated wisdom stood poised to claim leadership over them all. The Great Kurultai of 1206 would emerge from necessity as much as ambition. The traditional pattern of Mongol life, with its endless cycles of raiding, feuding, and temporary alliances, had grown strained under the pressures of a changing world. Chinese dynasties to the south offered both opportunities for wealth and threats of subjugation, while other steppe peoples pressed against Mongol territories with increasing frequency. Individual tribes, no matter how fierce their warriors or skilled their leaders, found themselves vulnerable to the coordinated military campaigns of settled empires and the combined forces of rival confederations. Through the harsh winter months preceding the Kurultai, Temüjin and his closest advisors worked tirelessly to secure the participation of clan leaders across the Mongol territories. The network of relationships he had cultivated over decades of careful diplomacy proved invaluable as messengers rode between felt tents and wooden halls, carrying invitations sealed with his personal mark. The prospect of unity appealed to practical minds weary of constant warfare, while the promise of shared conquests beyond their traditional boundaries stirred the imagination of ambitious chiefs. The location chosen for this momentous gathering reflected both tradition and strategic thinking. Near the sacred mountain of Burkan Khaldun, where Temüjin had once sought refuge during his darkest hours of exile, a vast encampment began to take shape, as spring brought renewed life to the grasslands. The symbolism was unmistakable to those who understood the deeper currents of Mongol spirituality and politics. This was the place where the future Khan had received divine protection, and now it would witness the formal recognition of his authority over all the tribes. As delegates arrived throughout the early months of 1206, the assembled multitude created a temporary city on the steppes, unlike anything the region had previously hosted. Thousands of horses grazed in carefully organized herds, their movements choreographed by experienced herders who ensured that no clan's animals strayed into territory claimed by potential rivals. The distinctive felt gurs of different tribes created a patchwork landscape of varying colors and decorations, each grouping maintaining its own customs while participating in the larger gathering. The negotiations that preceded the formal ceremonies revealed the complexity of tribal politics and the delicate balance Temüjin had maintained throughout his rise to power. Each clan brought its own grievances, territorial claims, and conditions for participation in any unified confederation. Some leaders demanded guarantees that their traditional hunting grounds would remain inviolate, while others sought assurances that their warriors would receive prominent positions in any combined military structure. The discussions often extended deep into the night, illuminated by fires that cast dancing shadows on the faces of men whose decisions would reshape the destiny of their people. Temüjin's ability to navigate these treacherous diplomatic waters demonstrated the political acumen he had developed through years of alliance building and strategic thinking. Rather than demanding absolute submission, he offered a vision of confederation that preserved many traditional structures while creating new opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. Warriors from minor clans could achieve positions of authority through demonstrated skill and loyalty, while established nobles retained their status through continued service to the greater cause. The religious dimensions of the gathering added layers of meaning that resonated deeply with the assembled tribes. Shamans from across the Mongol territories performed ceremonies that invoked the blessing of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, upon the proposed unification. Ancient rituals of blood brotherhood were adapted to encompass entire clans, creating bonds of loyalty that transcended traditional kinship structures. The sacred white banner, constructed from the tail hairs of specially chosen stallions, became a physical manifestation of the spiritual unity that would bind the confederation together. As the formal ceremonies approached, the organizational challenges of managing such a vast gathering tested every aspect of traditional Mongol society. Food distribution required careful coordination to prevent shortages that might spark conflicts between rival groups, while the maintenance of order among thousands of warriors demanded diplomatic skills of the highest caliber. The success of these logistical efforts served as a powerful demonstration of the efficiency and organization that unified leadership could bring to Mongol society. The climactic moment of the Kurultai unfolded with pageantry that honored both ancient traditions and the unprecedented nature of the occasion. Representatives from each participating clan stepped forward to formally acknowledge Temüjin's authority, their declarations creating a crescendo of voices that echoed across the assembled multitude. The presentation of gifts from subject tribes created a display of wealth and craftsmanship that illustrated the diverse resources available to a unified Mongol nation, from exquisite metalwork produced by settled artisans to the finest horses bred on the distant steppes. The transformation of Temüjin into Genghis Khan marked not merely a change of title, but a fundamental redefinition of Mongol political structure. The name itself, derived from the Mongol word for universal or oceanic, suggested a scope of authority that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of tribal leadership. This was no longer a confederation of equals bound by temporary agreements, but a hierarchical system with clear chains of command and unified strategic direction. The immediate aftermath of the Kurultai saw the implementation of organizational reforms that would prove crucial to the Mongol Empire's subsequent expansion. The traditional tribal structure gave way to a decimal system of military organization, with units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 creating a framework that could absorb new recruits and adapt to changing strategic requirements. This reorganization broke down old clan loyalties while creating new bonds based on shared service and common objectives. The establishment of the Mongol Empire through the Kurultai of 1206 represented the culmination of decades of careful preparation and strategic vision. From the ashes of exile and defeat, Temüjin had constructed a network of alliances and obligations that could support the weight of imperial ambition. The scattered tribes that had once viewed each other as rivals or enemies now found themselves united under a leadership structure that would soon project Mongol power across vast distances and diverse landscapes. The echoes of their collective declaration would resonate far beyond the steppes where it was made, carrying the promise and threat of a new force in world history that would reshape the political map of Eurasia through conquest and consolidation. The assembled tribes fell silent as the shamans completed their ancient rituals, the smoke from burning juniper branches drifting across the vast gathering like wisps of ancestral spirits, blessing this momentous transformation. In that profound stillness, as the last echoes of traditional chants faded into the endless sky above the steppes, something far greater than a mere coronation was taking place. The man who had once been known as Temüjin, the boy cast out into the wilderness to face starvation and enemies alone, was about to shed that identity forever, like a serpent discarding its worn skin. The Kurultai had spoken with one voice, and from their collective will emerged not just a new leader, but an entirely new concept of what leadership could mean across the boundless grasslands of Mongolia. The transformation that followed transcended the physical act of accepting the title of Genghis Khan, which scholars would later translate as universal ruler or oceanic Khan, suggesting dominion as vast and encompassing as the endless seas. This metamorphosis reached deep into the very foundations of nomadic society, touching every aspect of tribal life with revolutionary change. Where once dozens of scattered clans had wandered the steppes in loose confederations, bound only by temporary alliances and ancient feuds, there now emerged a unified nation with a singular vision. The old ways of blood revenge and tribal warfare that had defined Mongol existence for countless generations began to dissolve like morning mist before the rising sun of this new order. Genghis Khan understood that true power lay not merely in commanding armies, but in fundamentally restructuring the society that produced those armies. The traditional tribal divisions that had kept the Mongols weak and fractured were swept away with deliberate precision, replaced by a decimal military organization that cut across bloodlines and ancient loyalties. Warriors found themselves grouped into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, their allegiance flowing upward through this rigid hierarchy directly to the Khan himself, rather than to local chieftains or family patriarchs. This seemingly simple administrative change represented nothing less than the death of the old tribal system and the birth of a modern military state. The meritocratic principles that Genghis Khan instituted challenged every assumption about social hierarchy that had governed steppe society since time immemorial. No longer would birth determine a warrior's potential for advancement. Instead, courage in battle, loyalty to the Khan, and tactical brilliance became the currencies of promotion. Former enemies who demonstrated exceptional skill found themselves elevated to positions of high command, while members of noble bloodlines who failed to prove their worth discovered that ancient pedigrees offered no protection from demotion or disgrace. This radical reshuffling of power created a new aristocracy based on ability rather than ancestry, binding the most capable individuals to the Khan through bonds of gratitude and mutual benefit. The legal framework that emerged from this transformation established unprecedented consistency across the vast territories now under Mongol control. The Yasa, the great law code attributed to Genghis Khan, codified behaviors and punishments with clarity that eliminated the arbitrary justice of tribal elders and local strongmen. Religious tolerance became not merely a practical necessity, but a fundamental principle, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their spiritual traditions while swearing political allegiance to the Khan. Trade routes that had been disrupted by generations of tribal warfare suddenly flourished under the protection of unified Mongol authority, creating economic incentives that reinforced political unity across the steppes. The military innovations that accompanied this social revolution transformed the Mongol forces into an instrument of conquest unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. The traditional emphasis on individual heroism and chaotic charges gave way to coordinated tactical movements based on sophisticated communication systems and disciplined unit cohesion. Mongol warriors learned to fight as components of a larger machine rather than as independent actors seeking personal glory, their individual skills amplified by perfect coordination with their comrades. The famous feigned retreats that would later terrorize armies from China to Eastern Europe required levels of trust and communication that would have been impossible under the old tribal system of warfare. Intelligence gathering became an art form under Genghis Khan's direction, with networks of spies and merchants extending far beyond the borders of Mongolia to gather information about potential enemies and allies alike. This systematic approach to reconnaissance allowed Mongol commanders to enter battles with detailed knowledge of enemy strengths, weaknesses, and tactical preferences, transforming warfare from a game of chance into a calculated science. The psychological warfare that accompanied these military campaigns proved equally sophisticated, with carefully orchestrated displays of mercy and brutality designed to encourage swift surrender rather than prolonged resistance. The administrative systems that supported this expanding empire demonstrated remarkable adaptability to local conditions while maintaining central control. Conquered territories found their existing bureaucracies largely intact but subordinated to Mongol oversight, creating hybrid governing structures that combined steppe pragmatism with settled civilizations' administrative expertise. Literacy, once scorned by many nomadic warriors as a weakness of sedentary peoples, became a valuable tool in the hands of Mongol administrators who recognized its importance for managing complex governmental operations across vast distances. Cultural exchange flourished under this new order as never before, with ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions flowing freely along trade routes secured by Mongol military might. Craftsmen and scholars from conquered cities found themselves relocated to serve the expanding empire. Their expertise valued and protected by rulers who understood that cultural sophistication enhanced, rather than threatened, nomadic power. the Mongol court became a cosmopolitan center where Chinese engineers worked alongside Persian astronomers and European merchants, their diverse knowledge synthesized into new innovations that served imperial expansion. The transformation extended even to the spiritual realm, as shamanic traditions evolved to accommodate the realities of ruling sedentary populations with established religious hierarchies. While maintaining their connection to the eternal blue sky and the sacred earth of their ancestors, Mongol leaders learned to work within the religious frameworks of their subjects, presenting themselves as divinely appointed rulers rather than foreign conquerors. This theological flexibility proved crucial in maintaining stability across territories where religious identity often determined political loyalty. The speed with which this transformation spread across the known world reflected not just military conquest, but genuine administrative efficiency and cultural adaptation. Cities that had resisted other conquerors for months or years often submitted to Mongol forces within days, recognizing that cooperation offered better prospects than destruction. The reputation for both mercy toward the compliant and ruthlessness toward the resistant preceded Mongol armies like a herald, often accomplishing through reputation what might otherwise have required prolonged sieges. As news of these conquests spread beyond the immediate theaters of war, the very concept of political possibility began to shift across Eurasia. Kingdoms that had considered themselves secure behind mountains or deserts suddenly realized that no natural barrier could protect them from this new form of organized nomadic power. The age of isolated regional empires was ending, replaced by a new era of continental-scale political organization that would reshape the relationship between nomadic and sedentary civilizations forever. In the person of Genghis Khan, the eternal struggle between the steppes and the cities had found not a temporary victor, but a revolutionary synthesis that would define the character of empire for generations to come. The transformation from Temüjin to Genghis Khan marked not merely a change of name, but the birth of a military revolution that would reshape the very nature of warfare across the known world. As the newly proclaimed Great Khan gazed across the assembled tribes of the steppes in that momentous year of 1206, he carried within his mind a vision of conquest that extended far beyond the familiar grasslands of Mongolia. The traditional ways of tribal raiding and seasonal warfare would prove insufficient for the grand design taking shape in his thoughts, and so began the systematic construction of what would become history's most formidable military machine. The early conquests that followed Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongol tribes served as both testing ground and forge for innovations that would revolutionize the conduct of war. Unlike the chaotic raids of earlier nomadic leaders, these campaigns unfolded with methodical precision, each victory building upon lessons learned and tactics refined. The Khan understood that the scattered settlements and kingdoms beyond the steppes would require a different approach entirely, one that combined the traditional mobility of horse warriors with new strategies adapted to siege warfare and the conquest of fortified positions. The foundation of this revolutionary military system rested upon the decimal organization that Genghis Khan imposed across his growing armies. Every aspect of Mongol military structure aligned with units of 10, from the basic arban of 10 warriors, up through the jagun of 100, the mingan of 1,000, and finally, the mighty tumen of 10,000 riders. This mathematical precision created a framework of command and control unlike anything seen in the tribal confederations of the past, where loyalty had flowed through kinship lines and personal bonds between individual chiefs and their followers. Within this rigid organizational structure, the Khan fostered a meritocracy that broke decisively with the aristocratic traditions of steppe society. Commanders earned their positions through demonstrated skill in battle and unwavering loyalty to the Khan himself, rather than through noble birth or tribal connections. Veterans who had proven themselves in the crucible of combat found themselves elevated to command thousands, while sons of Khans who showed weakness or disloyalty discovered their privileges stripped away. This system created a cadre of officers whose dedication to Genghis Khan transcended all other allegiances, binding them to his cause with bonds stronger than blood or tribal identity. The revolutionary nature of Mongol military organization extended beyond command structure into the very composition of fighting units. Traditional tribal divisions gave way to decimal units that deliberately mixed warriors from different tribes and clans, preventing the formation of potentially rebellious regional power bases, while fostering a new identity centered on service to the Great Khan. A two-men might contain warriors who had been mortal enemies in the tribal wars of previous decades, now united under the banner of Mongol expansion and bound together by shared victories and the promise of plunder from distant lands. The early campaigns that tested this new military machine began with targets closer to home, as Genghis Khan turned his attention to neighboring peoples who had long existed on the margins of Mongol tribal politics. The Western Xia Kingdom, controlling the vital trade routes of the Silk Road through the Hexi Corridor, presented both an attractive target and a necessary stepping stone toward greater conquests. These initial forays revealed the adaptability of Mongol tactics, as steppe cavalry learned to coordinate with siege engines and assault formations necessary for reducing fortified cities. The siege of Volohai demonstrated the evolving sophistication of Mongol warfare, as the Great Khan's engineers, many recruited from conquered Chinese territories, deployed counterweight trebuchets and battering rams alongside the traditional tools of nomadic warfare. The sight of these massive machines, their wooden frames rising like giants against the desert sky, marked a departure from the purely mobile warfare that had characterized steppe conflicts for centuries. Yet the Mongols did not abandon their ancestral advantages, instead weaving siegecraft into a broader tactical framework that retained the speed and surprise that had always been their greatest strengths. The psychological dimension of Mongol military innovation proved as important as any technological advancement. Genghis Khan understood that terror could serve as a weapon more devastating than arrows or swords, and his early conquests established patterns of calculated brutality designed to encourage swift surrender from future enemies. Cities that submitted without resistance found themselves treated with relative mercy, their populations incorporated into the growing Mongol Empire, and their skills put to use in service of further expansion. Those that chose to resist faced systematic destruction, their fate serving as a stark warning to other settlements along the path of Mongol advance. The intelligence networks that supported these early campaigns represented another revolutionary aspect of the emerging Mongol military system. Merchants, travelers, and refugees fleeing the advance of Mongol armies carried with them detailed information about defensive preparations, political divisions, and economic resources of target territories. This intelligence apparatus operated with sophisticated coordination, gathering data from sources scattered across vast distances and synthesizing it into actionable military intelligence that guided strategic planning and tactical execution. The famous Mongol decimal organization extended naturally into logistical systems that enabled sustained campaigns far from the traditional grazing grounds of the steppes. Each warrior maintained multiple horses, typically 4 or 5 animals that rotated duties to ensure fresh mounts remained available throughout extended operations. This redundancy in horseflesh provided not only tactical mobility, but also strategic endurance, allowing Mongol forces to maintain operational tempo across seasons and terrain that would have exhausted traditional cavalry formations. The integration of diverse military technologies and techniques reflected the pragmatic genius that characterized Genghis Khan's approach to warfare. Chinese siege engineers worked alongside Persian metallurgists and captured European craftsmen, their combined expertise flowing into innovations that enhanced Mongol military capability. The famous composite bow of the steppes underwent refinements in design and manufacturing, producing weapons capable of penetrating the finest armor available to sedentary civilizations. Meanwhile, Mongol armorers learned to work with the finest steels, creating protective equipment that combined the flexibility required for mounted archery with the defensive strength necessary for close combat. The communication systems developed during these early conquests established precedents for the vast courier networks that would later span the Mongol Empire at its greatest extent. Arrow riders galloped across predetermined routes, carrying messages and orders that coordinated movements across theaters of operation separated by thousands of miles. These early experiments in long-distance military coordination demonstrated the organizational capabilities that would enable future Mongol campaigns against targets as distant as Eastern Europe and the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. The training regimens imposed upon Mongol warriors during this formative period combined traditional skills with new techniques required for the expanding scope of military operations. Young warriors learned not only the ancestral arts of horsemanship and archery, but also the disciplines of siege warfare, urban combat, and the coordination of combined arms operations. Great hunts that had once served primarily as sources of food and training in individual combat evolved into massive military exercises involving tens of thousands of participants, practicing formations and maneuvers that would later be employed against human enemies. The adaptability demonstrated by Mongol forces during these early conquests became perhaps their most distinctive characteristic. Armies that had perfected the art of cavalry, charges across open grassland, learned to fight in mountain passes, navigate river crossings, and conduct operations in forested terrain where traditional steppe tactics proved inadequate. This flexibility reflected not merely tactical innovation, but a fundamental shift in military thinking. As Mongol commanders embraced pragmatic solutions over adherence to traditional methods that might prove unsuitable for changing circumstances. The revolutionary military machine taking shape under Genghis Khan's guidance represented more than the sum of its individual innovations. The decimal organization, merit-based promotion, integrated intelligence networks, advanced logistics, technological synthesis, and adaptive training combined to create a military system unprecedented in its effectiveness and scope. As news of early Mongol victories spread along trade routes and diplomatic channels, the kingdoms and empires of the civilized world began to comprehend that they faced not merely another nomadic confederation, but a fundamentally new form of military organization that threatened to overturn the established order of international politics and warfare itself. With the scattered tribes of Mongolia now united under the banner of the Great Khan, the vast steppes that had once echoed with the sounds of internecine warfare fell into an almost mystical silence. The wind still swept across the endless grasslands, carrying with it the scent of wild herbs and the distant memory of countless battles. But now it whispered of something new, an empire that had grown beyond the dreams of any nomadic chieftain who had ever gazed across these rolling hills. The revolutionary military machine that Genghis Khan had forged from the disparate warrior traditions of the steppes hummed with quiet efficiency, its decimal organization and iron discipline creating a force unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. 10-man units formed the foundation of 100-man companies, which in turn built 1,000-man regiments, and at the apex stood the 10,000-strong Temüjins, massive formations that moved across the landscape like living entities, each one capable of independent operation yet seamlessly coordinated with the whole. The success of this new military system had been tested and proven in the crucible of Mongol tribal warfare, where ancient feuds and blood vendettances had provided ample opportunity to refine tactics and perfect the art of mounted warfare. The composite bow, with its distinctive recurved shape carved from horn and sinew, had become an extension of the warrior's very soul, capable of sending arrows with lethal accuracy while the rider maintained his thunderous gallop across uneven terrain. The psychological impact of these mounted archers, appearing as if from nowhere on the horizon and vanishing just as quickly after delivering their deadly volleys, had proven devastating against enemies accustomed to more conventional forms of combat. Speed and mobility had become weapons as important as steel and iron, transforming the traditional concepts of siege and battle into something fluid and unpredictable. As the seasons turned and the harsh Mongolian winter gave way to spring, Genghis Khan's attention began to shift toward the settled civilizations that lay beyond the boundaries of the steppe world. The Western Xia Kingdom, nestled along the crucial Silk Road trade routes that connected East and West, presented both an irresistible opportunity and a necessary stepping stone toward greater conquests. This realm, known to its inhabitants as the Great White and High Country, had grown prosperous through its control of the lucrative trade that flowed between China and the distant markets of Central Asia. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and precious metals passed through its oasis cities, leaving behind taxes and tribute that filled the royal treasuries and supported a sophisticated court culture that blended Chinese administrative practices with Tibetan Buddhist spirituality. The landscape of Western Xia differed dramatically from the familiar steppes of Mongolia, presenting the nomadic armies with their first taste of the challenges that would define their future conquests. Here, the endless grasslands gave way to harsh desert terrain, punctuated by fertile river valleys and fortified oasis settlements. The Yellow River wound its way through this arid landscape like a golden serpent, bringing life to cultivated fields and supporting populations that had never known the nomadic way of life. Massive earthwork fortifications protected the major cities, their walls rising from the desert floor like man-made mountains, designed to withstand the traditional siege techniques of settled armies. The Western Xia had grown confident in their defenses, believing that their combination of natural barriers and architectural ingenuity would prove insurmountable to any force emerging from the northern steppes. Genghis Khan approached this first major campaign beyond Mongolia with the methodical patience that had characterized his rise to power among the tribes. Intelligence gathering, always a crucial component of Mongol military strategy, took on new dimensions as his scouts and spies infiltrated the trade networks that connected Western Xia to the broader world. Merchants and travelers, often unknowing accomplices in this vast intelligence operation, carried back detailed reports about the kingdom's military capabilities, political divisions, and economic resources. The Mongol leadership learned of internal tensions within the Western Xia court, where Chinese-influenced administrators often clashed with more traditional Tangut nobility over questions of foreign policy and military preparedness. These divisions, carefully catalogued and analyzed, would prove as valuable as any weapon in the coming campaign. The initial Mongol incursions into Western Xia territory unfolded with the same tactical brilliance that had proven so effective in the tribal wars of Mongolia, but adapted to suit the unique challenges of desert warfare. The traditional Mongol strategy of rapid movement and dispersed attacks took on new meanings in an environment where water sources were scarce, and the movement of large armies required careful coordination with the seasonal availability of grazing for the vast herds of horses that accompanied every Mongol force. Supply lines, always a consideration in steppe warfare, became matters of life and death when extended across hundreds of miles of desert terrain, where a single miscalculation could doom an entire army to death by thirst or starvation. The siege of Yinchuan, the Western Xia capital, marked a pivotal moment in Mongol military evolution, as the nomadic armies encountered for the first time the sophisticated fortification systems that protected the major cities of settled civilizations. The massive walls that surrounded the city, constructed from rammed earth and faced with brick, rose to heights that dwarfed anything the Mongols had previously encountered in their tribal campaigns. Traditional steppe warfare tactics, based on mobility and the shock value of mounted archery, proved inadequate against these formidable defenses. The siege engines and assault techniques that would later become hallmarks of Mongol warfare were still in their infancy, forcing the Great Khan and his generals to adapt and improvise in ways that would fundamentally transform their military doctrine. Chinese military engineers, captured in earlier raids or recruited through the promise of advancement under Mongol service, began to play increasingly important roles in the evolution of siege warfare techniques. These technical specialists brought with them knowledge of catapults, battering rams, and the complex mathematics required to breach fortified walls. The traditional Mongol emphasis on speed and surprise gradually incorporated elements of methodical siegecraft, creating a hybrid approach that combined the psychological warfare of nomadic raiders with the systematic destruction capabilities of settled armies. The process was neither quick nor easy, requiring years of experimentation and countless tactical adjustments as the Mongol forces learned to balance their traditional strengths with the new requirements of siege warfare. The psychological dimension of the Western Xia campaign proved as important as its military aspects, as news of Mongol victories spread throughout the region like wildfire, carrying with them exaggerated tales of nomadic ferocity and invincibility. Cities and fortresses that might have resisted conventional armies sometimes surrendered without a fight when faced with the approaching Mongol Temüjins, their defenders having heard stories of what befell those who opposed the Great Khan's will. This reputation for merciless efficiency, carefully cultivated and strategically deployed, became a weapon in its own right, reducing the actual military effort required to subdue resistant populations, while conserving Mongol resources for the greater campaigns that lay ahead. The administrative challenges of governing a settled population presented entirely new problems for leaders who had spent their lives managing nomadic tribes. The Western Xia possessed complex bureaucracies, tax collection systems, and legal codes that bore no resemblance to the informal governance structures of steppe societies. Mongol administrators, working closely with retained Chinese and Tangut officials, began developing the hybrid administrative approaches that would later characterize the entire Mongol Empire. Traditional tribal concepts of loyalty and personal obligation gradually evolved to accommodate the more impersonal structures required to govern large settled populations, while the proven Mongol principles of meritocracy and religious tolerance found new expression in the multicultural environment of their first major conquest. The fall of Western Xia marked more than just a military victory. It represented the first successful transformation of the Mongol war machine from a tool of tribal unification into an instrument of imperial expansion. The kingdom's collapse demonstrated that the revolutionary military and administrative systems developed on the Mongolian steppes could be successfully adapted to the conquest and governance of settled civilizations. The rich cities and fertile agricultural lands of the former kingdom provided the economic foundation necessary to support even larger military campaigns, while the incorporation of Western Xia's technical specialists and administrative personnel added new capabilities to the growing Mongol state apparatus. As the dust settled over the conquered territories, and the reality of permanent Mongol dominance became clear to the surviving populations, the stage was set for even more ambitious campaigns. The techniques perfected during the Western Xia conquest, the combination of traditional nomadic warfare with sophisticated siegecraft, the integration of diverse military specialists, and the development of administrative systems capable of governing settled populations, would soon be tested against far more formidable opponents. The success in Western Xia had proven that the boundaries of the known world were not fixed, that the great walls and mighty armies of ancient civilizations could fall before the disciplined fury of united nomadic tribes, led by a vision that encompassed not just conquest, but the creation of an empire that would stretch across continents. In the vast silence that follows conquest, where the dust of battlefields has long since settled into the earth, and the echoes of war cries have faded into legend, there remains something far more profound than the memory of violence. The transformation of a single human being from the depths of abandonment to the heights of dominion stands as perhaps history's most remarkable metamorphosis, a journey that reshaped not merely one man's destiny, but the very fabric of civilization itself. The boy who once huddled in the bitter cold of the Mongolian steppes, cast out by his own people, abandoned to die beneath the endless canopy of stars, had become something beyond the comprehension of those who first rejected him. Temüjin, the child whose name meant iron, had indeed proven harder than the metal from which his identity was forged. Yet his legacy transcends the simple narrative of personal triumph over adversity, reaching into the deepest currents of human transformation and the eternal dance between destruction and creation that defines the rise and fall of empires. The metamorphosis from Outcast to Conqueror was not merely a change of fortune, but a fundamental rewriting of what it meant to be human, in an age when survival itself demanded the constant negotiation with death. The young man, who learned to read the language of wind across grass, who understood that the movement of clouds could mean the difference between life and starvation, who discovered that loyalty could be more valuable than gold, had developed a consciousness entirely different from those who lived within the comfortable boundaries of established power. His exile had become his education, his suffering, his strength, and his isolation the foundation upon which he would build bridges across continents. The steppe had taught him that survival required not just physical endurance, but the ability to see patterns invisible to others. The migrations of animals, the subtle changes in weather, the complex relationships between competing tribes, all of these became texts he could read with the fluency of a scholar. This deep literacy of the natural world, combined with an intuitive understanding of human nature forged in the crucible of betrayal and abandonment, created a leader whose vision extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of nomadic ambition. As Genghis Khan, he had discovered that conquest was not merely about taking territory, but about transforming the very concept of what territory could be. The Mongol Empire became a living testament to the possibility that the margins could consume the center, that those deemed barbarian could redefine civilization itself. His armies moved across the landscape like a force of nature, but they carried with them something far more revolutionary than weapons. They carried the idea that identity itself was fluid, that belonging was something that could be earned rather than inherited. The legal codes he established, the meritocratic systems he implemented, the religious tolerance he mandated, all of these innovations emerged from the perspective of someone who had lived outside the structures of conventional power. His laws protected the rights of women in ways that scandalized traditional societies. His promotion of individuals based on ability rather than birth challenged the fundamental assumptions of aristocratic cultures. His insistence on religious freedom created spaces for dialogue and exchange that had never existed before. The great cities that fell before his advance, Samarkand, Baghdad, Kiev, were not merely conquered but transformed into nodes in a vast network of communication and trade that connected east to west in unprecedented ways. The Silk Road became more than a commercial route. It became the circulatory system of a new kind of world, one where ideas, technologies, and cultural practices flowed with the same freedom as goods and gold. The Chinese invention of paper and printing press found its way to European monasteries. Islamic mathematical concepts merged with Greek philosophical traditions. The cross-pollination of civilizations occurred on a scale never before imagined. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of his transformation lay not in what he conquered, but in what he preserved. The boy who had been rejected by his own people became the architect of a system that celebrated diversity while demanding unity. The man who had known the deepest loneliness became the creator of a brotherhood that transcended ethnic and religious boundaries. His generals included Chinese strategists, Persian administrators, and Arab merchants, alongside Mongol warriors. His court spoke in a dozen languages, and his laws were written in scripts from across the known world. The transformation of Temüjin into Genghis Khan represented something far more significant than the rise of a single individual. It embodied the possibility that human consciousness itself could evolve, that the experience of marginalization could become the foundation for a more inclusive vision of power. His story suggested that true leadership might emerge not from privilege, but from the depths of human experience, from the places where conventional wisdom failed and new forms of understanding became necessary for survival. The empire he created outlasted his physical presence by generations, but its true legacy lay in the demonstration that the boundaries between civilized and barbarian, between center and periphery, between ruler and ruled, were far more permeable than anyone had previously imagined. The nomadic values of mobility, adaptability, and pragmatic cooperation became the governing principles of sedentary societies. The democratic elements of steppe culture, the assemblies where decisions were made collectively, the traditions of debate and consensus, influenced the administrative structures of kingdoms and empires across 2 continents. In the quiet moments of historical reflection, when the grand narratives of conquest and empire fade into the deeper rhythms of cultural change, The transformation of the abandoned child into the world's greatest conqueror reveals itself as something more subtle and more powerful than mere military triumph. It becomes a meditation on the nature of human potential, on the ways that suffering can become wisdom, isolation can become independence, and rejection can become the foundation for a more expansive understanding of belonging. The steppes where he first learned to survive continue their ancient cycles, grass growing and dying with the seasons, herds moving across landscapes that seem unchanged by the passage of centuries. Yet something fundamental shifted in those vast spaces, something that rippled outward across the world and continues to influence the way humans understand power, identity, and the possibility of transformation. The legacy lives not in monuments or museums, but in the quiet recognition that the margins of society often contain the seeds of its renewal, that those who have been cast out might return not as conquerors, but as teachers of what it truly means to be human.